I've never used a background before, so we'll see if I can figure this out.
Oh my.
It's never too late to teach old dogs new tricks, right?
There you go.
Look at
There you
that.
You did it. We're proud of you.
Okay, except it's reversed.
No, it's
Oh,
only
reversed
reversed
for
for
you.
you.
It's only reversed for me. Okay.
Well, are we ready to go ahead and get started? Should I just start it off, Rich?
Sure, what the heck? I actually took a little time to review the paper this morning.
That's good.
So I kind of remember what we did, kind of.
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the next installment of the AMR Origin series. Today we're going to do things a little bit differently because our usual host, Richard Makadok, is the author of the paper that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm Sherry Thatcher. I'm the editor of the Academy Management Review, and I will be co-hosting this interview with Kyle Mayer, who's an associate editor of AMR at this point in time. The paper we're going to be talking about today is co-authored by Kubilay Cirik and Rich Makadok, and it's entitled First Mover Advantages versus First Mover Benefits. What's the difference and why does it matter? So first off, thank you everyone for being here. This is going to be fun. I look forward to actually leading the interview as opposed to being on the other side of it. And then Rich, I know that your position's reversed, so this will be a little bit.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Sherry. I appreciate you and Kyle interviewing us today about this paper.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for being here. But let's get started by, I think a great way to start is just give us a brief 1-minute elevator pitch of what this paper is about and why this manuscript is important.
Yeah, so in this manuscript, in this paper, we introduce a novel concept called first mover benefits. Concept which is conceptually and theoretically different from the FMA, the traditional entry timing concept, which is FMA, first mover advantage concept. And they are different because in this paper we tackle the issue of selection bias, which is a major issue leading to lots of problems in entry timing research. And we do this by developing a formal model where we incorporate various firm level and market level factors, and our model provides certain, several interesting results. One of the major ones is that when firms enjoy a large enough competitive advantage, the FMA will exceed its FMB. So FMA cannot be used as a proxy for FMB. So that's basically, 1-minute summary of the paper.
And let me add just a brief clarification of the terminology. So FMA, first mover advantage, and first mover benefit differ in terms of the benchmark to which you are comparing the first mover's performance, right? So in first mover advantage, one would be comparing the pioneer's performance to the performance of followers. In first mover benefit, one would be comparing the pioneer's performance to the performance that same firm would have gotten if it were not the pioneer, right? So FMA is an actual comparison of actual firms' performance, right? So kind of a comparison across firms within a single entry order scenario, but FMB is a comparison for a single firm across entry order scenarios, right? So it's different that way. And FMB accounts not only for what a firm gains by pioneering, but also for what it loses by not following. That's another important difference between the two.
This is a really interesting concept, Rich, this separating advantage from benefit. looking at the counterfactual benefits of what I did versus what I could have done, which is obviously what first mover advantage is kind of supposed to get at, but obviously we can't observe that. So which scholars do you think will benefit the most from reading this paper and thinking about these ideas?
Obviously, there's a large literature on the impact of entry order in strategy, in marketing, and even in economics. So I would think that anybody who has an interest in the impact of entry timing or entry order on performance would be a relevant audience for this.
More broadly, I think it's going to be interesting for management researchers, all management researchers who do empirical research as well as theoretical research, because we are tackling the issue of endogeneity. And that's a concern for all empirical researchers. So the different, the context is a strategic management context. Obviously, it's going to be more interesting for people in strategy, economics, and marketing. I think it will be interesting. Still, I think it will be interesting for people.
So the target audience is just all of strategic management, basically.
Yeah, simply because the focus is on endogeneity. That's why this difference between FMA and FMB, arises.
Right. So the other thing I would add to that is that, you might ask, well, why do we need FMA at all? Right? What's the purpose of that? Because from a normative perspective, if we're going to make prescriptions for what firms should be doing, then really FMB is all that matters, because that's comparing the firm's performance to what that firm would have performed if it had chosen differently. So from a prescriptive perspective, that should really be the only criterion that matters. But that's forward-looking. We also do have backward-looking purposes, right? So if I'm a resource-based researcher trying to figure out why one firm came to dominate an industry, that's more of a backward-looking purpose, where FMA really is the relevant criterion rather than FMB. And so I think the larger point that the paper raises in terms of understanding performance implications of any decision, whether it's entry order or anything else, is your purpose forward-looking or is it backward-looking? And that may determine what baseline you want to compare performance to.
I also, from a very, very outsider's perspective, had the sense that this paper might have some implications even for entrepreneurship scholars as they're thinking about, with limited resources and trying to decide, where should I go in terms of where do I put my resources? Then this kind of thinking might have some value in terms of for that literature as well.
I think you're right about that. That's perhaps where the stakes are highest in terms of entry order decisions. Do I want to wait and see whether a market materializes before entering, or do I want to try to have the pioneering benefits of preempting others? I mean, entry order decisions and commitment timing more generally is a trade-off between the preemption benefits of early entry in basically a game against other rational players versus the flexibility benefits of delayed commitment in a game against nature in some sense, right? So if I just want to see what's the right decision to make, then delay has some benefits in terms of giving me more flexibility to make the right choice after the right choice is clear. But of course, then you're more vulnerable to being preempted by someone who entered early, right? So there's that natural trade-off, and that's a particularly sensitive trade-off, as you say, for entrepreneurs because they have limited resources. And they're unlikely to get a second chance if they make the wrong choice early on. So, flexibility. And the other thing about entrepreneurship is, stronger firms may be able to catch up more easily. Right. And so they suffer less of a first mover, they may have less of a first mover benefit, stronger firms, better established firms, because they can more easily catch up. Whereas if you're an entrepreneurial firm, a couple of people in a garage trying to get something started with limited resources, if you don't enter first, and then a stronger firm beats you to the market, you're unlikely to be able to get that second chance.
Right. Yeah. So Kubilay, how did this project get started in the first place? As the Origin series, our audience really wants to know, how did you come up with this idea, and how did it get here? How do we?
So that project actually started 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 2014 in June, when Rich was organizing this, one of the last ACAC conferences, I think. So I started my PhD at AMR University. That was back in 2013. So at the end of the first year, we had this research proposal requirement where we're required to develop a research proposal during the summer. And before coming to Emory, I had an MBA, and I was interested in these platform markets. And as you know, platform markets are characterized by network externalities. So while going through the literature, I have realized that entry timing studies in industries with network externalities provided conflicting findings. Some of research was showing that those firms entering into such markets early dominate the markets, and in other cases there will be followers. We'll see followers dominating the market. So what explains this conflicting findings? So with that thing in mind, I approached Rich, and I thought that it would be a good idea to develop a formal model that could explain under what contingencies pioneers are expected to dominate a market characterized by network externalities, and under what circumstances we would expect followers to dominate the market. So that's how it started. And actually, the original version of this paper is the first essay of my dissertation. So we made a lot of changes to the final version is a bit different. It's actually quite different from the original version, but that's how it started.
Well, that's really great to know. And especially, I think, for some of our younger scholars that may be listening, to know, your dissertation oftentimes has the seeds of something that could be a great AMR manuscript. So that's really great for us.
And the importance of persisting with the project, as Kubilay points out, it took many, and there were some self-inflicted wounds on our part, in terms of, we started with a model that was way too complicated, and that slowed us down quite a bit. But still, the importance of persistence. Let me just add one piece to Kubilay's story, which is, and this was to me the interesting part. When we started working on the project, we decided, okay, well, there was some period of time where we were going to work separately on it, and Kubilay was going to try to make his effort to do a model, and I was going to try to make my effort to do a model, and we did that, and we came together, and we realized his results did not match to mine at all, and they were just completely different. And we spent maybe an hour looking at them or something like that. We couldn't quite figure out what was going wrong. And so I said, Kubilay, can you just take these two sets of results and figure out what we did differently, what was generating these different results? Well, Kubilay came back the next week and said, Rich, I figured it out. We're defining first mover advantage differently. One of us, I can't remember who it was defining first mover advantage in terms of, the comparison of the pioneer to the follower. And the other one was comparing the pioneer's performance to its own performance if it had moved second. And, we realized that, hey, maybe that's the paper here, is to look at that distinction between these two different ways of gauging the benefit of moving first, right? Whether I'm comparing myself to my competitor, or whether I'm comparing to the performance that I would have gotten if I had moved second. And then we realized all of a sudden, well, there's an interesting paper right there, regardless of the network effects, right? We thought we were writing a paper about the impact of network externalities. And it turned out that was actually too complicated. That complicated the math very, very much. But
That's really interesting, right? That kind of these differing assumptions
right.
are actually led to an understanding that this is something really interesting. And by unpacking all of that, this can lead to a contribution that is really important for the field to know.
And it led to us to change the way we thought about the paper completely. From instead of being a paper about network externalities, now it was a paper about two different ways of defining first mover advantage. And eventually we completely lost the network externalities piece.
Interesting. And so once you kind of got to that point where you realize like, this is a really cool idea, obviously to go from that idea to getting the paper published or accepted, it takes a lot of time and effort. So what was it about it that you felt was so interesting that you wanted to continue to devote your time and effort to this paper?
As I mentioned, I've already, had some interest in the first version of this paper when it was submitted to AMR had this network externalities part. So I was already interested in that part, the platform industries and etc. Plus this FMA and FMB distinction that we've discovered. I personally think it's really important because this is an area, entry timing is a very traditional area. Lots of hundreds of papers have been published by researchers in different fields like economics, marketing, and strategy. But there's not a solution. It's a well-acknowledged problem. The selection bias issue is a well-acknowledged problem, but it's not really being tackled before, like we tried to tackle. So it's so for me personally, it was so easy to see that there's some strong potential pursuing this idea, and there might be rich thought that there might be might even have some publication potential. So that's why we decided to pursue the idea.
Great.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that. So yes, I think the initial impetus was okay. People are when they're talking about first mover advantage, they may be thinking about first mover benefit, right? They may be in effect using first mover advantage as a proxy for first mover benefit. And so what interested me was, okay, well, under what circumstances would that be a good proxy versus a bad proxy, right? And it turns out that basically if a firm has a substantial competitive advantage in its market, then it's going to be a bad proxy. And we can talk about those results. But the other thing that made me interested in it was not that it's not just an empirical issue. It's not simply that we have to get our fix the endogeneity issue and the self-selection bias issue. That there's really a theoretical difference between these two concepts, one being forward-looking, the other one being backward-looking. And it made us think about what are the implications of this for the entry decisions, for the entry order decisions. So, let's say we have two firms and, we're trying to figure out which one of them will enter the market first. Well, if only one firm has a positive first mover benefit, then it's clear who's going to enter the market first. It'll be the one with the positive first mover benefit, right? But it's possible also that both firms have a positive first mover benefit, right? And then we get into kind of a pioneering rush scenario where they might both be eager to get into the market first, and they kind of get into a race. But for me, perhaps the more interesting case is the case where maybe neither firm has a positive first mover benefit. They might both want to be in the market, but and they might both benefit from being in the market, but neither one wants to be in the market first, right? So there's a difference between wanting to, benefiting from being in a market and benefiting from being first in the market. You can benefit from being in a market without, but still rather be second. And so if all firms have a negative first mover benefit, which can happen, for example, if there are market development costs to be paid, right? So if you're pioneering a new market category and you have to educate the public about what this product category is, and that's costly to do. And other followers then can free ride off of the expenses that you've paid to educate the market about what this thing is. Then there's actually, then you can have a situation where all firms have a negative first mover benefit. They would all like to enter, but nobody wants to enter first. And so we call that scenario adverse pioneering. And it can lead to, if not market failure, then at least market delay. And we have in the paper an example of where the minivan market actually could have been started 9 years earlier than it was, if it were not for the fact that there was an adverse pioneering situation going on.
It's such an interesting situation there, Rich. I mean, that example is one that's tough because it highlights the problem here that one advantage of first mover advantage is that everything's observable. So when you shift to an analysis where you're comparing to a counterfactual, or so it's yes. Forward looking. So it's if we do this, if we do that, it's now we're estimating of what we think is going to happen. It gets really murky for firms to try to do that. So it's sort of, as I was thinking about this paper, sort of taking a step backwards, to me, one of the biggest contributions of this paper in a larger context, not first mover advantage, is to get firms and managers thinking about not just comparing themselves to other firms. I'm going to copy that firm because they did this. Oh, that firm did it, they were successful, let me do that. And continually thinking about, I mean, we talk about imitation and strategy all the time. People imitate the right. Successful firms. But get them to think about, wait a minute, rather than just saying that this move worked out well for that firm, I should copy them. It's like, wait a minute, but will that move work out for me? Let me think about whether or not my performance would be better copying them versus, waiting or doing something different with them. If we can get firms to shift their mindset to this thinking of comparing my future with this direction versus my future with that, as opposed to just too much copying without consideration for context, that's a huge benefit to the business community to try to get people to think that way, comparing their own performance under different states and decisions, rather than just looking forward to that. I think it's a really nice way to think about that. Because, Chrysler benefited huge. The minivan saved Chrysler. You can pretty much
absolutely
argue. So it's one of those things where, was it really, yes, they had to do some market development costs, but being first hugely helped them in that particular scenario. So so the specifics of that are like, it's always ones where it's because I love this conceptual distinction between the adverse pioneering versus the pioneering rush. That's awesome because it's like thinking about that, but this is always going to be one of those where this insight is so powerful to think about it. But it is one of those tough things about, and I think the mindset is so valuable, but it's still just, it's a tough thing to articulate and think about and estimate for the future, your performance under different states. But I love the mindset point of this really particularly well.
Right. Yeah, I like to make the point to my MBA students, that in a game theoretic sense, like when I talk about dominant strategy, it's
right.
A comparison of your, across your options, right? So which of your options is the best strategy for you? It's not about dominating the competitor. It's not about having a higher performance than they do. It's about which of those strategies is going to benefit you the most. And those two only coincide if we're talking about a zero-sum game. And, the world is not necessarily a zero-sum game.
Exactly. So true. So just to shift gears just a little bit, one thing that's always interesting for people to think about when they're working on papers and trying to do this kind of research is how the authors worked together as a team in moving the idea forward. You have a particularly interesting, setup here where it's sort of advisor, advisee, as well as co-author here. So can you just talk a little bit about the dynamic of your relationship and how you worked together to push this idea forward, especially in the context of the fact that you have an advisor, advisee, when now it's of course, now you've moved on, but how the development worked in terms of that dynamic.
I probably should just let Kubilay answer that one.
Yeah, so so I came up with this idea about developing a paper on entry timing in industries with network externalities. So what we'll do is meeting once a week, and we'll discuss about the model setup. we really did. I really did not spend a lot of time on literature review when we first started. That's what I was expecting Rich to tell me initially. But it's more like, developing the model, and that will be my first experience in developing a model. I think that's why we started this way. And every week we'll have one-to-one meetings, and Rich will check my work and provide recommendations. We've made lots of changes on the model, and incorporating new variables, eliminating already incorporated variables, and etc. And after we have agreed that the model setup is the best setup to tackle that issue, we I've worked on it, tried to solve it. Again, shared my results with Rich, and then the next step was developing, starting writing the paper, doing literature review. That part I did first, and then once I complete the task, I will return it to Rich, and he's going to check the work, and he's going to make his own additions. And that's how we worked together during this process.
It's great. So the next question I want to ask is about the challenges you faced on this project. But along with that, I really would love for you to talk about how, you talked a lot about the modeling, but in fact, the modeling piece of this paper is just an appendix. And really the rest of the manuscript is written for the AMR audience. And we now allow for formal modeling to be part of AMR, but it has to be readable to people who may not understand formal modeling. Mm-hmm. So when you answer the question about what challenges you faced, I'd also love for you to be able to tackle that question about how you took the formal modeling piece of it and turned it into a manuscript that anyone can read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the thing that you mentioned was actually our biggest challenge, to make it readable, to make it accessible for the AMR audience. And during this process, I would like to thank all the editors and reviewers. They provided great constructive criticisms. And one of the best comments or suggestions made by the editor was that, make sure your third year or fourth year or fifth year students can read this paper. That was a great suggestion. And then Rich contacted our PhD students at Purdue who already completed their comprehensive exams to go through this paper and provide their comments. And we got their comments and made necessary changes. So that was a great suggestion. And in a way, the editor helped greatly us to deal with this problem.
Yeah, I like to try to write papers in a way that they are accessible to to even a first-year doctoral student who doesn't know anything about formal modeling, it's a matter of kind of, I don't know, to take a step back from the work and think about how it would look to a person who knows nothing about the topic, right? What would and it's very easy for me to get so close to the project and so close to the model and the work that it's hard for me to know what to know what I know and to understand what somebody who doesn't know what I know needs to know in order to get to where I am, right? But I have to do that. I have to think, okay, well, what would I need to have explained to me in order to get why I'm doing this, why I'm making these choices, and then try to write that explanation.
Yeah, I think that is so important, and I think almost every author of an AMR paper has had a similar experience of being so close to it and having to figure out how to take that step back to do that. The other thing I think, I really appreciated, because I could actually read the whole paper, not having a great understanding of formal modeling, was I really appreciated your table 1. I mean, which compares the differences, the FMB and FMA, and you talk about it in the paper, but to be able to just look at this table and so clearly and quickly be able to say, aha, I get it. I understand why these are 2 different constructs and needed to be treated as such. So was that table something that you had there in the first place, or was this something that came about as you worked through the various versions of the submission?
I can't remember. I'd have to look back to see what the
I will
early.
expect it to be in the first version, because this paper, as my job market paper, I was presenting another paper, but that was linked to this paper. So I had this figure in my presentation slides. So we must have thought about it before submitting to AMR. That's
Yeah, I think sometimes too, right? If you're actually presenting something, you put it in a form that's quite simple, like quite easy for people to quickly grasp.
Yeah.
And so it's important for authors of AMR manuscripts to remember, like, if you present it, then maybe the form that you have it in could be accessible in the manuscript as well. And so those two things might go hand in hand.
Yeah, I think the paper definitely benefited from the fact that Kubilay was presenting elements of the paper as part of his job market talks. And so it kind of forced us to, especially forced him to think through, well, how do I explain this to, to a department that, maybe is only a minority in strategy, right? Maybe has a majority in OB, and still have it make sense.
And so quickly related to that, you already talked about some of it, but did the paper change a lot between the first submission and the final article? Or do you feel like you had a pretty good sense of it?
Yeah, and there was a lot of self-inflicted pain on this one, because we for too long hung on to the idea that this was a paper about network externalities, and that really made it a lot harder than it had to be. Would you say?
Okay, so even the first paper you submitted to AMR, the first submission actually was about network externalities.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the titles actually. The initial title was First Mover Advantages versus First Mover Benefits in Industries with Network Externalities. So that was the first title. And the last title is FMA versus FME. What's the difference and why does it matter? So, the direction, the focus has significantly shifted.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and it changed in other ways as well. I mean, that's an obvious way that we shifted the focus from network externalities to FMA versus FMB in general. But it also shifted in terms of how we explained the concepts, how we motivated and justified the manuscript, and then I'll say this: there was one really excellent reviewer who pushed us on the question of what are the implications of this for entry order decisions. And those comments were what led us to write that section on pioneering rush versus adverse pioneering. And that was a very late addition to the paper. That was like after, I think we added that in the third revision. And so, we had a really excellent set of reviewers and outstanding editor who pushed us in a variety of ways that really motivated us to add value to the manuscript, even after 2 or 3 rounds of review.
Yeah, before Kyle kind of gets to the last question, or maybe he has some other questions, but I want to jump onto that and just say, a lot of times we kind of picture this mean reviewer who's trying to get the paper rejected, right? But so many times reviewers have really great ideas and they come up with things that push you to think a little differently. And so I think rather than thinking of them as our adversary, but to think of them as our challenger who's kind of really trying to push us to be better, and to think a little bit further than what we might have originally been thinking. And so your experience suggests that it happened.
Absolutely. And it motivated us to add a whole new concept to the paper, this concept of adverse pioneering, which, who knows, may turn out to be something that people want to build on in the future, right? Because it's a different form of market failure than we usually think about. We usually think about market failure perhaps as arising from adverse selection, which is an information asymmetry between a buyer and a seller. But adverse pioneering is actually about an incentive symmetry across sellers. Right. it's a different way that a market can fail. And we wouldn't have had that in the paper at all if it had not been for this reviewer's comments and suggestions.
Well, it's an interesting place to extend because you're kind of describing it as sort of it exists and it's a cost borne by whoever would go first. So it's this, disincentive to go first. But you could also think about that as one that might vary by firm based upon their complementary assets, based upon these kinds of things. It might be that your firm has a pretty significant, adverse reaction to going first, whereas I'm in a different situation. So I want to go first, or I have less of a cost of going first than you do. And then it really gets into this interesting competitive dynamic, which kind of, again, springs into more ideas of thinking about how you might build this out.
Exactly.
One of the things I always like to ask people about the papers of how they get this. So I'm, writing theory sections is always something I've enjoyed and exploring those different kinds of ideas. But your topic of first mover benefit, I think we talked about that really well. I love that. It's a really interesting concept. How did you come up with these specific factors for looking at when you should be looking at benefit versus cost? Because you got these ideas of demand volatility, you're looking at proprietary value creation, preemptive potential. How did you come up with these factors? Did they come up during the review process, or were these with all the ones you had in the paper at the initial submission?
This was actually during the review process, right? Because the same reviewer, I think it was the same reviewer who pushed us with the adverse pioneering. Yeah. Also, and he or she, I don't know, also pushed us to, to get rid of the network externalities piece and just pare it down to the different pieces of value creation, right? That some would be common to firms in an industry, some would be firm specific. Some would be due to entering first. Some would be, maybe more generic, available to anybody regardless of when they entered, right? So that gives us a 2x2 matrix of these different pieces of value creation capability, and that really, we would not have had that if it were not for the reviewer. That was definitely something that was added later. But the demand volatility was needed because, again, commitment timing decisions are a trade-off of preemption benefits of moving early in the game against rivals versus flexibility benefits of moving later in the game against nature. And so the demand shock was nature's move, right, in the model, right, was the way of getting nature into the model, and the volatility of that demand shock, determines how strong of a player nature is in some sense.
That's a very cool way of thinking about it. It's always that you always get that question from reviewers so often: why these factors and why not other factors? Why only these? And having that sort of clear 2x2 of these are the two factors, it creates a 2x2. These are the fours that are going to go into the model and thinking about that. It creates a nice set of an explanation for why these factors to address that question in a nice way.
Hal Varian had this great paper called "How to Create an Economic Model in Your Spare Time," and I assigned it to my students. And one of the things it says is, and one day, eventually, I will follow this advice. It says, start as simple as you can possibly think of in terms of the model, and then simplify it further. Yeah. And what we did, unfortunately, and what I do way too often in my modeling efforts, is I start with a complicated model and then wind up having to pare it down. Now, in this case, I think could perhaps be excused for that mistake because we thought that the model was going to be about network externalities, which is what made it complicated in the first place. Yeah. But eventually I will follow Hal Varian's wise advice.
Yeah, the reviewers are very helpful in simplifying the model, because sometimes you have this, excessive focus on the model, like it is the end thing that you should focus on. But you have to recognize the fact that it's just a tool, just like empirical data and empirical methods. It's not it should be the tool. It should be just seen as a tool to help you, get the conclusions and takeaways from the paper. So we had this comments from the reviewers saying that the model is overcomplicated, lots of variables and etc. So this is the way you can approach it. They provided some, suggestions on how we can simplify them, and it was really helpful.
This
I
is an
think it's
issue not
always-
just for, oh, good.
I was just going to say it's always really interesting because I think as the editor and as AEs, we're always telling authors who ask us, you can't make something too complicated. But then when you're actually the author, it's so easy to make it complicated because some of the things that seem so simple seem too simple to be enough of a contribution. But if you really get down and you dig in the weeds and get into the depth of it, it is a contribution because you're extending something in a really deep, thoughtful, conceptual way.
Right. And not that the model we had wound up with was this incredibly simple toy model either.
No,
It's
I
not,
wasn't saying that.
it's not so terribly simple, but it's much more manageable than what we started with.
I'm sorry, Kyle, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, it's fine. But this issue, this thought process we're talking about is not just an issue for formal model papers.
Right.
Any paper you have has to have what I call the yellow brick road. And you got to lead people down that yellow brick road. And whether you're doing it from a model, whether you're doing it through verbal theorizing, whatever you're doing,
Or a
you have to give
simulation,
them-
whatever. Yeah.
what's that? Yeah, exactly. Propositions, however you think about it, metaphor, analogy. You have to give them enough information so that they can follow your thought process. And every author has this issue of what am I assuming? Because I've thought about this so much in my own head, it's not actually on the written page. So I see why A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D, but I haven't given the reader enough information to make that link and association. And that's where I love this about whether it's formal model and how much detail to put into the model, whether it's verbal theorizing and how much, or informal theorizing and how to explain that. There's always this balancing act of putting in enough that everyone can follow the links to help understand, here's where we started from, here's the problem, here's the question, down to here's why we had what we did, here's the outcome, here's how it kind of played out. And that's a process everyone goes through. And it's great to hear your journey on that. So as we move onward with this, what impact do you want this paper to have in terms of thinking about what kind of follow-up work would you like to see? What kind of empirical work would you like to see building on this? But where do you see this idea going?
Obviously, one of the measure, selection bias along with other issues like survival, definition of first mover advantage, its measurement. These are among the major reasons where we're getting conflicting, and context, differences in the context are the major reasons why we see conflicting results in anti-timing literature. So in this paper, I think we are tackling one of these major issues. And obviously, I'm hoping that next paper, future papers will be thinking about this distinction, FMA and FMB distinction when developing the paper. That's one. We also provided some avenues for empirical researchers because it looks very challenging to find empirical data to be able to measure FMB, and that's a very valid question. So that's all fine. FMB looks good, but how exactly are we going to measure it? And we provided some in the discussion part. I think we provide avenues for empirical researchers, and we are actually developing a paper, working on a paper with Rich, which hopefully is going to be sent to SMJ for another review. So we found this data set from Washington State, where a lottery was held in the marijuana retailing industry to determine the early entrants. So using this data set, we are able to measure FMB actually. So we provided this kind of suggestions in the paper as well. What else? FMB, I think, is a powerful concept when you view this distinction from a managerial perspective. FMB seems more relevant than FMA for managers. And we're also thinking of developing a practice-oriented paper that could, that will reveal more about this distinction and how it can help managers.
Yeah, I'll add a few points to that. I mean, Kubilay mentions the empirical implications, which I think are important, right? That empiricists need to think cleanly and clearly about the distinction between FMA and FMB, and about how asymmetries between firms can drive a wedge between FMA and FMB, even if those asymmetries are not entry order specific. So I think the paper gives empiricists a guide for thinking about how severely their measures might be biased, depending upon the degree of asymmetry between the firms. But we also provide a set of, I think, 6 or maybe 7 possible ways that empiricists could think about measuring FMB directly. because, it is a tricky thing to measure given that it's counterfactual in nature. Kubilay mentions one of them that we're pursuing in the project on the Washington State marijuana retailing industry, where basically the state ran a nice natural experiment for us to basically assign some entrants to enter early and others to enter late. And so we can get kind of at least a population-wide measure of FMB there directly. But there's other approaches. I think we have, like I said, 5 or 6 other approaches that one could use to try to measure FMB more directly. But I think, in terms of theory, I think there's other ways that one could extend this model. We made certain choices to simplify the model. So, for example, there's no friction in the competition in the model, or at least no friction way to vary the amount of friction, market friction. You could add that. We have only 2 firms in the model. We have only 2 time periods. We did not allow for exit. There's a lot of things that are left out of the model that one could incorporate into the model. And then I think, Kyle, as you said, in terms of pedagogy, I think getting managers to think through the difference between the advantage and benefit, I think, is an important thing. To know that what would give me an advantage doesn't necessarily give me a benefit, and what would give me a benefit doesn't necessarily give me an advantage, is an important thing for us to emphasize for managers. So yeah, I think those are all some implications that could come out of this paper.
Yeah, I think it's going to be important, though, to be careful about, it gives me an advantage, not a benefit, not an advantage. Those 2 terms sound interchangeable at a high level. But I think that the core piece of it, though, is also just thinking about, I'll be careful of this distinction between comparing my performance to someone else's versus comparing my performance if I take path A versus path B. Yeah. And it's sort of this way of thinking about, I got to think about what's best for me in terms of the different options that I'm facing as an organization, compared to just saying, oh, that worked out for that firm, I better follow that path over there. Exactly. And that's, and again, we got to work on the terminology, make sure the terminology matches that way of sort of thinking and comparing with the backward looking versus the forward looking.
Well, thank you. Is there anything else that we forgot to ask you that you would like to say about this paper? Except read it. Yeah, everybody read it.
Definitely read it.
Yeah,
well, also, not just read it, but assign it to your doctoral students.
Yes. Well, it is a very interesting paper. Like I said, this is not my space generally in terms of research areas, but I found it very interesting. So I encourage our audience to go and look at this paper. And again, it's entitled First Mover Advantages versus First Mover Benefits. What's the difference and why does it matter? It's on our in-press page at Academy of Management Review. And especially for those of you who are interested in formal modeling and are kind of wondering, how do I do that for an AMR audience? This is an excellent example of how you could do it. So I appreciate everyone being here, and Rich and Kubilay for taking the time to meet with Kyle and I today.
Well, thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Kyle. We really appreciate it too. And I'm quite delighted to hear that you found it to be a readable paper, Sherry, given that it's pretty far outside your area of expertise.
Yep, it was definitely, and it was interesting. I kind of took away from it going, I never really thought about something like that before, which is always what I love to get when I read an AMR paper. So,
very nice paper.